In January of 1967, the state colleges around the state in Sacramento protesting Reagan's initiative to raise tuition for graduate students at the CSC campuses. So we've seen this process for a long time. With that little background, I'd like to get into some more formal comments. I think the premise of what I'd like to say is that public education, or the status and the character or nature of public education in California, and for that matter throughout the United States, is integral to capitalism. And more specific, it's integral to the accumulation of capital, or the accumulation model that characterizes capitalism at any particular stage. Just to give a brief definition of capital accumulation, and this is taken from Karl Marx, the accumulation of capital is the gathering or amassing of objects of value, the increase in wealth through concentration, or the creation of wealth. And just to abbreviate these comments here, this capital accumulation can occur in a number of ways: profits, rent, interest, royalties, capital gain, or some other kind of return. We'll talk about a few others later when we talk about the current situation. I think the next point I want to make related to capital accumulation, and this is fairly an arbitrary date that we're going to use. It isn't necessarily chiseled into stone, but we could say that beginning in 1789, when the so-called New Republic, or the Republic, was formed, we've seen three general stages of capital accumulation in the world, and specifically in the United States. That first stage was approximately between 1789 and the 1860s, maybe up to 1870s. And to label that model of accumulation, we could call it agricultural capitalism, or the stage of agricultural capitalism. At the same time, starting somewhere around the 1810s, 1815s, we can see gradually the emergence of a manufacturing sector as well that is going to be very prominent in the next stage of capital accumulation. The second stage is between the 1870s and the 1970s, a long period of approximately 100 years. And many people, Baran and Sweezy to start with, have labeled this period the stage of monopoly capital. And this is characterized by concentration of wealth, centralization, obviously corporations. But the core means of accumulation during that period was industrial production. Although we can look at different stages of that history as well. Certainly after 1945, we see a specific stage of industrial production as the major means for capital accumulation. The third stage, and perhaps the stage that we're living in now, started somewhere in the mid-1970s. Most of us are familiar with the so-called structural crisis of capitalism that started somewhere in the late 60s into the 70s. The declining rate of profit is maybe a major reason for that. Certainly the recession of 1973, 1974 is the pivotal moment when we see a major shift in the nature of capital accumulation in the United States. That particular stage is defined by the writers in Monthly Review as monopoly financialization. And what we can see is that there are specific means in which dominant capital has been able to accumulate capital. Let's make a list here. One, tax cuts, tax breaks, outsourcing production, at first to the South and obviously to the Third World. Military spending is very pivotal in this process, as well as privatizing services, as well as speculation. what we can say that starting in 2008, with the financial crisis of 2008, we can see two additional factors in that model become prominent. One is bailouts by the state, and two would be raiding the public sector. And that's what we are here to talk about tonight. In fact, I want to add a few academic inputs in this discussion. One of the major writers about this process is a guy named David Harvey. He's a Brit who is a sociologist, although I think he teaches at NYU as well. And he's called this latter process, bailouts, raiding the public sector, et cetera, accumulation through dispossession, okay, which I think is a very appropriate label here. Now, I think what's next, what I want to comment on next, is that what I just laid out was the means by which capital has been accumulated since the 70s, with a focus on the last 4 or 5 years. What we also have to say, though, is that paralleling or complementing or interrelated to this accumulation model has been a political project as well. And what this political project is called is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a hegemonic ideology, or the dominant ideology. And what that ideology does is establishes the acceptable parameters for policy formation, policy debates, policy outcomes, and policy implementation. Also, that hegemonic ideology, and any hegemonic ideology, also defines the relationship between the market and the state. And for that matter, the role of the state and the role of the market within the political economy. Just to make note of it, I think we've seen in the last, since 1789, maybe 3 hegemonic ideologies. During the 19th century, it was laissez-faire or classical liberalism. By 1900, we see the beginning of the second hegemonic ideology, and that's corporate liberalism. I think many people might feel more comfortable with terms like the New Deal, the Great Society, the New Frontier, etc. Those policies could be defined within the framework of corporate liberalism. Neoliberalism began to be constructed in the 1970s. And there's an excellent book by Joel Rogers and Tom Ferguson called Right Turn that was published in 1982 that documents this process in the 70s. Harvey's book, Neoliberalism, also does that as well. Now, again, saying that hegemonic ideology establishes a set of acceptable factors, what are the guidelines? What are the guidelines that establish the parameters? Well, they're obvious, and I think most people in the room probably are quite familiar with these. 1, cutting taxes for the wealthy. 2, eliminating social welfare programs. Privatizing the public sector. Deregulating the economy. Busting unions. And 6, defining or shaping labor relations. For example, under corporate liberalism from, say, 1900 to about 1970, the nature of labor relations could be defined as Fordism. I think most of the audience is familiar with that, where workers were unionized within a particular framework, received high wages and benefits, and they were basically the consumer class for what is being produced. There are a lot of other factors in defining it, but I think that's it in a nutshell. Under neoliberalism, the form of labor relations is flexible labor relations, as well as obviously outsourcing as well. So what I want to argue is that the assault on public education that has intensified since 2008 is central to the current accumulation model and the guidelines for that process are defined by neoliberalism. Now, the next area that I'd like to comment on is what is the historical relationship of public education to capitalism. Is that the nature of public education is integral and in fact shaped and defined by the needs of capital at any point in time. I'm going to sneak a conclusion that I'm going to make here to make it clear what I'm trying to say, is that this assault on public education isn't just an attack on public education. It's the state and capital trying to redefine the nature of education in our society to fit the current needs of capital at this point in time. Why I think this knowledge is important is I think in organizing against the privatization of public education, I think it's really important to know who the enemy is and what they're doing to us, okay? One's activities and protests. Without going into any major history of public education since the late 19th century, what I think you can see is that public education was shaped by monopoly capitalism, or corporate liberalism, if you will, even a little before the advent of corporate liberalism, 1900. In the late 19th century, to serve the needs of the growing corporate manufacturing industrial structure. From, let's say, the 1870s to 1945, we see one particular form that public education took. Its role was fundamentally to promote the reproduction and channeling of the future workforce. And it did this in a variety of ways. Obviously, a socialization process was involved, obedience, how to take orders, etc. Patriotism was central, and the specific curriculum was important too, related to channeling people into particular sectors of the economy. But after 1975, what we can see is an additional component to the role of public education, and more specifically, higher education. It was still about socialization and it was still about channeling, but public education also became a reserve labor pool as well, to house young people that weren't trained yet or did not necessarily have a place within the labor market. So, I mean, there were really firm structural roles of education. Now, I may be here trying to be objective and scientific about this. I don't want to, what I want to add to this is that there still is human experience within these institutions. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the brilliant teachers and the inspiration I got and the various resources it made available. But when you kind of dig down to the structure or the skeleton of what public education was about, and for that matter is about, I think that's the basic purpose of it, the socialization, channeling, and to establish a reserve labor pool. To quote a few giants in the literature of capitalism and public education, I'd like to read the following. Herbert Gintis and Samuel Bowles, back in the 70s, wrote the classic book, Schooling in Capitalist America. And almost anything you read about that subject since has to and always refers to Gintis and Bowles in their argument and their analysis. Gintis and Bowles wrote in the 1970s, and I think it's quite relevant to today. Major periods of educational change are responses to alternatives in the structure of economic life associated with the process of capital accumulation. The common school movement of the 19th century we have seen develop to complement a burgeoning factory system increasingly rendering the family inadequate to the task of reproducing the capitalist division of labor. The progressive era accompanied the transition to corporate, i.e. monopoly capitalism, in light of which the small, decentralized common school was manifestly and anachronistically both in its internal social relations and in the degree to which it could be, it could be centrally controlled through established social policy. Gintis and Bowles continue, crisis periods appear in retrospect as the major turning point in the United States educational history. Let me repeat that quote because it's central to my argument. Crisis periods appear in retrospect as the major turning point in United States educational history. I'd like to read one more quote here, if you bear with me, written by John Foster Bellamy, who writes regularly for the Month Review in an article he wrote several years ago about capitalism and capital accumulation in education. Schooling, therefore, is meant to serve production and replicates the hierarchical division of labor of the productive system. Hence, both the dominant purpose of elementary and secondary schooling in capitalist society, the formation of workers or labor power for production, and the labor process internal to schooling itself, as carried out by educational workers, are fundamentally and conditioned by the relations of production in the larger economy. I hope that made some sense. Now, the next chapter, or comment I'd like to talk about is the current realities of the privatization or the assault on public education. Reading my own writing here, therefore, since the 1970s, the restructuring of public education has been integral to the demands of the monopoly finance stage of capital accumulation, guided and dictated by neoliberalism. We can go all the way back to the 70s, and certainly to the early 80s under Reagan, to begin seeing the formation of the project of privatization of education. Reagan's A Nation at Task, which was a report that was issued under Reagan, is perhaps the central document in this whole history. What that document did claimed that public education was failing, okay, which is the premise that the whole argument of reform, so-called reform, is based on today. But what they did is, rather than look at the real reasons for the difficulties public education was experiencing, meaning a decline in job opportunities, income, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, as a footnote, I went to George Washington High School in Los Angeles, 108th and Normandy public high school. And when I went there in the early 60s, it was about 98% white. And there was burgeoning factory jobs and service sector jobs. Within 15 years, it is now predominantly an African-American community, while there is a deindustrialization process and a cutting of services. So obviously the quality of those schools, the two experiences that school would have would be different. So rather than blaming the real causes of the problems of public education, that report shifted the onus to individual responsibility, the family, and obviously teachers, okay? And I reel when I hear that idea. The Bush administration had policies, the first Bush administration and Clinton. All of these programs were the foundation for Bush II's No Child Left Behind, and obviously Obama's so-called race to the top, which is simply a rebranding of No Child Left Behind and an expansion of No Child Left Behind as well. Now, certainly since 2009, 2008, 2009, we've witnessed an intensification of the assault not only on public education, but also on the public sector as a whole, and certainly on public worker unions and public worker pensions. In noting that assault, obviously I want to put into the mix here is Naomi Klein's book, Shock Doctrine, which obviously helps us to understand that you have a crisis and capital can take advantage of that crisis to further its own accumulation process. Now, the next point I want to make, and this is, I'm winding down here, Steve, okay, bear with me. This is a medium-sized lecture, okay? It's not a long one, nor is it a short one. The last point I want to make is how is this assault being carried out, which I think is really, really important. We've kind of given you the background as to why it's happening, and so I'd like to make some comments on the process that's going on. What's fascinating about all of this is everywhere you turn to try to find allies within the establishment, you find that those allies are supporting privatization of public education. The Democratic Party, the leadership of most teacher unions, many teacher unions, etc. Even Oprah Winfrey supports privatization. I'm going to make a confession. 2 years ago, I came home for a nap from school, and I don't watch Oprah Winfrey on any regular basis, but I happened to turn the TV around looking for some sports trivia that I could watch to ease my mind, and there was Bill Gates there. So they were talking about Waiting for Superman and celebrating this film that was out, which is a piece of propaganda justifying the creation of charter schools. So even Oprah is in favor of the privatization of public education. What I'd like to just point out, I think everybody's familiar with this, but let's kind of put out a verbal chart here, is that what you have is both the state operating in a bipartisan fashion in promoting this movement or this process, operating in sync with institutions within the civil society, think tanks, advocacy groups, unions, etc., and obviously national consensus that it has already been legitimized by the system, and that any struggle against that process, like the Chicago teachers' strike, goes up against enormous odds. And the best example is the failure of the Obama administration to lend support to those teachers during that strike, on the verge of an election which he needed union voters to vote for him. Related to this consensus, I'm going to propose two things that are kind of conceptual. One, this is my idea here, is that this promotion of privatization of public education is part of what I'd like to call a single issue consensus building campaign. It's part of a single issue consensus building campaign. The attack on pensions, going back to the 70s and 80s, the attack on welfare, etc., would be other examples of how all of these institutions mobilize around a general agenda. To add a person of a little higher intellectual status in all of this, Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci talks about how capital can establish dominance in the state or control over the state, not just using coercion of force, as Lenin proposed in The State and Revolution. But Gramsci proposes that what the state and capital tries to do is to gain control over the civil society with the intent of, quote, to form a dominant class, let's repeat this, to form a dominant class-defined collective or consensus in support of the specific agenda among the competing and conflicting social classes. So the idea is to get the working class to buy into the agenda of the dominant interest, thinking that there is a piece of the pie in some form that they might be able to participate. I'm not sure how effective this is at this point. That's where Steve's going to answer that part of the equation. But very quickly, the institutions are obviously the state. And then what we have is a number of other forces. The centerpiece tends to be the foundations. Gates, Lumia, Broad, the Walton family, Ford, et cetera, who fund various projects. And I think there's three major categories that they fund. One is the push for charter schools. Two, to undermine teacher unions. And three, to promote testing. They also fund advocacy groups and think tanks that are involved in the so-called educational reform movement. One example of that would be the Institute for Higher Educational Policy, which is very prominent in this project. They also fund, directly or indirectly, what I label recruitment agencies. For example, there is an organization called Teach for America that goes around recruiting young people to teach in schools in urban areas for possibly 2 years, etc. Obviously, good experience for these young people, but are they experienced teachers? And what is the hidden agenda that is increasingly more transparent? Obviously, to circumvent and to weaken unions, for example. One organization that is a byproduct for Teach for America is something called the Leadership for Educational Equity, or LEAS. And I think of all of these groups, this is the one that's probably the most sinister, because what it aims to do is to train and educate individuals who will be a cadre of teachers, one, but also individuals to run for school boards, PTAs, to be superintendents of school districts, to be administrators, as well as to educate elected officials along the lines of this project. So I guess what I'm saying, the structure of this consensus is very, very daunting, to say the least. Certainly the media, as well as many unions, certainly the AFT leadership under Randy Weingarten is very, very supportive of this project. So I guess that's all I will say now. Thank you. We'll take questions later.